good morning. Thank you very much. So perhaps we could have the presentation up. That would be great. Thank you. Yeah, so I realized as I was walking up the beautiful Vatican path this morning that this title probably is a little bellicose for the surrounding. But in any case, it will become clear in the course of the talk, hopefully, why it is that I feel attacking inequality is important in fighting poverty. So the talk has 6 quick parts. I'll just introduce 3 interrelated concepts, talk a little bit about the recent progress against poverty and in sharing prosperity, and in that part I'll be able to go quickly because Jeff yesterday already made some of the points I wanted to make today. Then a discussion of how the road becomes tougher ahead despite the substantial progress we've had so far, why I think inequality holds the key, and a few concluding thoughts. So in this talk, I'll really talk about 3 concepts. It would be great if we could have the presentation up on the screen, please. Are they there? Anyway, the three concepts are extreme poverty, shared prosperity, and inequality. Extreme poverty, as Jeff said yesterday, refers here to a rather narrow concept of monetary poverty, which is by no means the only concept of poverty one could have. But in this case, I will focus on monetary poverty, defined as some information, particularly the number or share of people living under a very demanding poverty line of $1.90 per person per day in 2011 purchasing power dollars. By shared prosperity, which is a term that people introduced at the World Bank at least in 2013, we mean the rate of growth in mean income for the poorest 40% in each country. Thank you. And by inequality, I'll mean particularly relative, but in some cases absolute gaps between people, and in some cases between people who live in the same country, and in other cases between people who live in different countries. So here you have 3 basic concepts in welfare economics that you're familiar with. Poverty, some information about the bottom of the distribution. Shared prosperity is really about changes in welfare, although a truncated measure of welfare at the bottom of the distribution, and inequality. Now, before I show you some pictures, let me spend a moment on where this $1.90 line comes from. On the left in this diagram, you have the 74 countries for which we had poverty lines, national poverty lines, in the work by Martin Ravalion and co-authors in the late, in 2009. The $1.90 line, which replaces or supersedes earlier versions of the international poverty line that you may have heard of, like the $1 a day line, or the 108 line, or the 125 line. These are not numbers that we just make up. They're anchored on the national poverty lines of the poorest countries in the world. So in this particular case, in 2009, what Ravalion, Chen, and Sangrala did is they looked at the countries for which we had information on their poverty lines, and there they are. You have their log income or log consumption per capita on the horizontal axis, and their national poverty lines on the vertical axis. And if you look at the flat part of the line, where the line flattens out at the bottom, then the average of that was 125 at 2005 purchasing power parities at that time. The history of poverty measurement that we've undertaken at the World Bank has always required updates when the purchasing power parity exchange rates have changed. In 2014, the International Price Comparison Project, which produces these exchange rates that are meant to allow us to compare standards of living across countries in realistic terms, issued a new set of purchasing power parity exchange rates, the 2011 exchange rates. And we updated from 2005 to 2011, simply, as the table on the right shows, by taking the values of those 15 lines in domestic currency, in their local currency units, in 2005, inflating them by their domestic inflation, their domestic CPI, to 2011, and then converting them at the new exchange rate, which got us to 1.88, which we rounded up to 190. So the $190 poverty line was designed to keep the purchasing power parity of the previous line constant. And the reason for that was the Sustainable Development Goals, the first Sustainable Development Goal, and the World Bank's own poverty elimination goal were defined in terms of the 125 line. So we wanted to keep its purchasing power parity, its purchasing power rather, I'm sorry, in developing countries constant. So at that line, we have here a slightly updated version of the graph that Jeff showed you yesterday. It's interesting because the graph he showed you yesterday, which was based on last year's work at the bank, finished in 2015, but as he indicated, 2015 was a forecast. This finishes in 2013, and so counterintuitively, it's newer. And the reason is that we're not actually showing a forecast this time. So these are all estimates. We're not making a nowcast, as it were. But what you see very much, as he showed yesterday, is this big decline in poverty. So the blue line here is the absolute numbers of people in the world living under $1.90 a day from 1990 to 2013. And the red line is the proportion of people. So as we saw yesterday, a decline from 1990 of about a third. 1 in each 3 people in the world living under $1.90 is extremely demanding, extremely limited consumption possibilities, to just over 10% in 2013, which is the last year for which we have actually credible data. So just over 10%, just under 11%. In absolute terms, that's a decline which sounds even more pronounced because, of course, over these almost 30 years or 23 years, the world's population kept growing. So the decline in proportion is even more marked when you look in absolute terms, from about 1.8, 1.9 billion people to about 767 million people today. I won't have time now to tell you about all the caveats and errors that may be involved in this, but I do want to caution that looking at these lines, we don't know, we have no way of drawing confidence intervals around this because sampling error is not the issue here. There are other kinds of error that are more complex. But I do want to say that this is subject to considerable uncertainty, unlike what these lines may suggest. And if you have interest, I can discuss this at some length, and probably at the risk of boring you in question time. Here's a picture by region. And again, we see some of the things that Jeff pointed out yesterday. I wish the pointer, there is a pointer, you can see the green line there, but it doesn't go on the screen. But the top line at the very left is East Asia. You see the fabulous decline in the dark blue in East Asia over this period. The top line is Sub-Saharan Africa, which was about the same level of poverty as East Asia as recently as 1990. As recently as 1990, China and East Asia were as poor as Sub-Saharan Africa, with incidences above 50%. But whereas East Asia has gone down to around 4 or 5%, Sub-Saharan Africa has seen a decline, but only to about 40-something%. The world is the magenta line in the middle where you see that decline. And here you have the same picture for absolute numbers. So the line at the top now, the world is obviously not an average, it's a sum. So the world is the top line, and you see the decline that we've seen before. The red line is East Asia. By far, most poor people in the world lived in East Asia, over 1 billion people in 1990, much less now in red. The decline that we saw in the head count, in the proportion of poor people in Africa over here, the blue line does bend down, wasn't enough to offset population growth. So in Africa, the absolute number of poor people in the blue line has actually gone up over this period, resulting in a distribution of the poor today, which is shown here. So again, this very extreme definition of monetary poverty now leaves us still with 760 million or 770 million or so at the best estimate of people living in extreme deprivation in the world. Half of those people now live in Sub-Saharan Africa. A third live in South Asia. 10% live in East Asia. And basically a small residual live in the other 3 regions in which we divide the world: Europe and Central Asia, Middle East and North Africa, and Latin America. What else can we say about those people? Well, they are actually mostly young. This is the age profile of the poor. On the left there, you have the age profile of the poor, and on the right, the age profile of the sample population. So the red here is adults, the black is people aged 60 or over. So the rest there is children aged 0 to 17 in various different colors. And the point to take is that in the population as a whole, the non-black, non-red, so the right-hand corner of the right-hand graph there, is about 32% of the population. But amongst the poor, those 0 to 17 are 50% of the population. Now that is, for those of you who are inequality nerds like me, that is, of course, sensitive to assumptions we make here about equivalent scales and economies of scale within the household. Here we're assuming simple per capita incomes. So this exaggerates the picture. If we made certain adjustments to allow for economies of scale in consumption within the household, or for differences in costs between children and others, this picture would look less stark. But qualitatively, the finding that the poor are predominantly children would be robust even to those adjustments, as a paper that we have shows. So I've shown you evidence, a little bit of evidence on the profile of the remaining poor today, but I've also shown you something that, as I said, Jeff mentioned yesterday, which is actually remarkable progress in combating international poverty, extreme poverty, since 1990. Although I indicated that there is considerable uncertainty around the estimates of levels in this calculation, I do share Jeff's view yesterday that this decline is actually robust to most things you could throw at it. So there has been progress against extreme poverty, even though it remains, of course, morally unacceptable to have almost 800 million people living in conditions of such squalor. Let me turn to the second concept I introduced at the beginning, which is that of increasing welfare or sharing prosperity. And since shared prosperity refers to income growth for the poorest 40%, you might think it's very, very similar to poverty reduction. And indeed, in some ways it is. But in this picture here, I show you how they cover different bits of the world's population. So what you see in this picture, the area, the total rectangle, is the world's population. And the world's population lives in countries which are ranked here on the horizontal axis from those with the highest poverty headcounts to those with the lowest poverty headcounts. So the orange yellow mass here is the poor at $1.90. So and then the line at 40% divides the bottom 40 in each country from the top 60. So you've got 4 colors there. The people in orange are poor at $1.90 and live in the 40% poorest in their countries. The yellow are still poor, but are not in the bottom 40% because they live in very, very poor countries. The blue are the bottom 40%, but they are not extremely poor by our international poverty line. And the green are the non-poor, top 60%. What can we say about the incomes of the bottom 40% across countries that we can compare between, say, 2008 and 2013, which is the period that we look at? So here, let's not focus on the names of the little countries because you probably can't see them here. But here's a little picture that divides the regions. The regions here from the left to the right, if you can read that, are I can't read it, so I'll read it on my handout. They are East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, the industrialized countries, Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, going from left to right. The bars, the white bars, show the growth in per capita income in the household survey between 2008 and 2013. And the blue, the shaded blue, shows the growth in incomes in the bottom 40%. So when you have a country where the shaded blue is above the little bar, you see, well, income grew in that country, but it grew even faster for the bottom 40%. Now, there are 83 countries here of the 190 or so, and the reason there are 83 is that those are for which we can compare data for these 2 periods in time. As you can see, even though this period included the global financial crisis, there was still mostly positive growth. In fact, in 60 of the 83 countries here, mean incomes for the bottom 40% grew, and in 49 of those 60, they actually grew faster than the average, and therefore than the top 60%. The 2 big exceptions are the industrialized countries and Europe and Central Asia, where you see a number of countries below the horizontal axis. And that's no surprise. We know that the global financial crisis hit incomes primarily in North America and Europe. Developing countries are now struggling in many cases, but that struggle is not captured here. Between 2008 and 2013, developing countries were mostly resilient to this process, which meant that over this period, there was still growth in average incomes for the bottom. We may see some deterioration in that as the picture moves forward. So though I'm cautioning that this is still, way too many people living at poor conditions, and that having 23 countries where the bottom 40% lost income in this period is also a terrible thing. Despite those, the picture so far is really one of considerable progress, both against poverty and in promoting welfare at the bottom. Unfortunately, it would be wrong to extrapolate from that going forward and assume that we will easily reach the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, our work looking at this data suggests that the road ahead will be much tougher than the road so far has been, and that in large part is a consequence of the fact that the poverty that remains is harder to reach. So here you've got, in orange you've got the headcount rates, in the red bars you've got numbers of poor people. On the left, you have low income, lower middle income, and then upper middle income countries. So you see that most of the poverty that remains is in low and lower middle income countries. And then you have on the right the 10 countries with the greatest numbers of poor people. Still a large number in India, which has the large red bar there on the right. And you do still see some numbers in China, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. But everywhere else there is in Africa, including in countries with governance and economic situations that are very complex, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, or under low oil prices, Nigeria. And the finding is that because the poverty that remains is more concentrated in fragile states or in states that are heavily reliant on natural resources, where the elasticity of poverty with respect to growth has historically been lower, it's actually going to be harder to keep reducing poverty in the way that we have so far. In fact, if we do some simulations in the computer, and we just take these household surveys, and we project forward their income to 2030, assuming that there is no change in distribution, you've got the middle lines here on these curves. These curves are going from 2013 to 2030. They're all simulations of what might happen to poverty as you go forward. So you see poverty beginning at around 11% there in 2013, and you see the decline. The red line is 3%, which is the bank's more modest interpretation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 1.1. We knew we'd never get to zero so quickly, and so our goal is to get poverty down to 3% by 2030. That's what we mean by ending extreme poverty. And what you see there in the middle line in those graphs is that even if you simulate growth going forward at the rates of the last 10 years, which is the left graph, or the rate of the bottom 20 years, which is the right graph, you don't get there. You don't get there with no change in distribution. The lines around the middle are changing the distribution, are making growth more inclusive below the middle line, or less inclusive above the middle line. We do this by this thing we call the shared prosperity premium, M, which is the difference in rate of growth between the bottom 40 and the mean. And so on an average shared prosperity premium of 1 percentage point, meaning growth more inclusive by having the bottom 40 grow faster than the rest, in all these countries, we would be able to get to 3% by 2030 if countries were growing as fast as they did in the last 10 years, that is 2003 to 2013. In this room, I guess I don't have to tell you that that's still incredibly optimistic, because that decade was a decade of very rapid progress in the developing world. And with current commodity prices as they are and the international situation as it is, it's unlikely we'll have that same growth rate. That is to say, in summary here, that although there has been very large and considerable progress in reducing global poverty at the international poverty line so far, the picture ahead looks much harder. And in fact, it looks like we're only going to be able to meet these international goals if we reduce inequality within countries, if we make growth more inclusive. Otherwise, we won't make it. So what can we say about inequality? What has been the trajectory on inequality? So we also look not only at poverty and shared prosperity, but a little bit at inequality itself. And I should say, by the way, I didn't say in the beginning, this presentation is based mostly on a recent report that the World Bank launched earlier this month, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, called Poverty and Shared Prosperity, Taking on Inequality. So all of this stuff is in there, and most of you, I think, will have received a link from the organizers of the workshop yesterday that has a link to the online version of that report. Now, on inequality, let me start with global inequality. In this picture here, we draw on work by François Bourguignon on the left, in his recent book, The Globalization of Inequality, and then our own work using the Lachner-Milanovic data on the right. These are pictures of global inequality. Let's look a little bit at a graph on the left, where François, building on his earlier work with Christian Morisson, showed the trajectory of the global Gini coefficient. That's the Gini coefficient taking each citizen of the world as one unit. So it's the income inequality combining inequality within and between countries. And what you see is that secular rise in global inequality from around 1820 to 1980 or 90. But then at the very right, you see this, it's a different line because the PPPs change, the purchasing power parity exchange rates change, but you see a decline. Actually quite a sharp decline since around 1990 or so in global inequality. This is now rather well known and accepted in the economics profession, but may still come as a surprise to some people that actually the global inequality by this measure is declining. It's declining very largely because of rapid growth in China and India, which are moving the mass of the distribution in those highly populous countries towards the world mean. It's enough to visit Shanghai or see the number of Indian and Chinese people in the airports that you all travel in to realize that this is not an illusion. Africa, too, is part of that, at least between 1994 and 2014, 20 years of rapid growth in Africa over that period. On the right, we take a different measure, the tile index, but of the same thing, global inequality. And there you can decompose it in inequality between countries, the yellow top of the bars, and within countries, which is the red part of the bar. Two things to take from this. Most of the inequality in the world is not the inequality you see in the streets of Rome or within Italy or within Brazil, high though that inequality is. Most of the inequality in the world is the inequality between countries. But that's also the inequality that's been falling the fastest, as you see there. The inequality within countries, which is the orange part, has, as you see here, been rising as a share of total inequality. And I think Professor Zamani mentioned this fact yesterday in his introduction. Now, one of the newer findings in this report is that although that inequality within countries has been rising as a share of total inequality, it has actually stopped rising as well in the recent period. When we found some evidence of this, we couldn't quite believe it. So we tested it in various different ways. And you have some of the ways here. You have, this is within country Gini coefficients, averaged. The averages can be weighted by population. Those are the blue lines, or unweighted by population. Those are simple country averages in red. They can be between the two samples we have in 2008. Sorry, this is what, 1988 and 2013. They could be simple, they could be unweighted, they could be unbalanced, so the two samples that we have. Those would be the thick lines, the uninterrupted lines. And the dotted lines are the ones that we look only at balanced samples, so the same countries in 1988 and 2013. So it depends a little. Unweighted, you actually see a bit of a decline from around 2000. if you weigh them by population, because inequality has been rising in India, and through some of this period had been rising in China, though it's declining more recently, when you weigh it by population, you don't see quite a decline in blue, but you see a flattening. You see that inequality within countries over this period has actually stopped rising as well. This is just a table that, you know, we won't spend any time on. There's too many numbers there. But the numbers I wanted to have here for you to see at the very bottom, if you look carefully, or if you save your handout for use in future dinner party conversations, you'll see that in the long-term trend there, you see there are 91 countries we have. And there, most of the countries were still rising. So inequality within countries was rising in 42 of those countries, falling in 39, and was in a kind of confidence interval, you know, in between 1 percentage point increase or decline. We call that a wash, since we're not sure, in 10 countries. But in the more recent part, which is the right-hand side, there are 81 countries there, and actually in 41 of those, we see a decline in inequality. Now, what is behind that decline would be the subject of a much longer conversation, but some of the candidates that people have pointed to include actually an improvement in policies in a lot of developing countries, both macroeconomic policies, notably in the cases of Africa and Latin America, but also some increases in policies of redistribution, some improvement in social transfers in particular that I'll come back to in a moment. But there's also a strong element of good luck and a good external scenario. So the very high commodity prices that we saw until quite recently, it helped increase, particularly the agricultural commodity prices, helped increase some rural incomes. And they also made it easier for governments to finance some of their spending in developing countries. Some of that is now gone, but we'll come back to that. Now, this is a very, very rosy and optimistic picture to our own surprise, even though I've just pointed out that we need, that the road ahead is tougher. We are still, what I've been showing you is not only a decline in global poverty, but even a decline in global inequality at still extremely high levels, still unacceptable levels, but still a decline. And even within countries now, at least no longer rising. But let me give you two important caveats, though, which I think are important. One of them is that these household surveys do not typically very well capture the very rich. So if you think of Thomas Piketty, you think of the top 1%, those people are typically not captured in this household surveys. So here I show you now some data from the Piketty et al. Database, the World Wealth and Income Database at the Paris School of Economics. On the left, you have the graph that's quite famous now with rich countries over a long period, since 1900 to 2015. You see, this is the share of the top 1% using tax data for those countries. And you see very high levels until the Second World War, and then the collapse in capital incomes of the Second World War, the rise of welfare states, unionization and all that, the big decline in all of those countries at the Second World War. And then France and Japan kind of stay on those levels. The United States has the huge resurgent in inequality at the top that you see in the yellow line. The right-hand graph has a comparable graph for poor countries, or poorer countries, developing countries. None of them is a really poor country, but they are South Africa, Argentina, India, Korea, and Taiwan. And you see big increases here. If we had these people in the household survey data, we may see a different picture than I've shown you before. So that's an important caveat. The other important caveat is that inequality measures, like the Gini coefficient and the tile, are based on proportional differences. To keep the Gini coefficient constant in this room from today to tomorrow, what we need to do is increase all of our incomes by 10% or 1%. If we increased our incomes by €1,000, that would change the Gini. So absolute and relative gaps are different. And keeping relative inequality constant will typically be consistent with a huge increase in inequality in levels. Because if you raise a rich person's income by 10% and a poor person's income by 10%, the absolute gap grows. These pictures just show you that for two different countries. I think they're Argentina and Uganda. In red, you have what we call the growth incidence curve, the proportional growth in income along the distribution from poor to rich. And in blue, you have the absolute growth incidence curve, the growth in dollars rather than in percent. And you see in Argentina, for example, would show you a big decline in inequality in our data set, but that is consistent with the difference in pesos between rich and poor people growing. So one has to be aware of those caveats as one assesses these decline in relative inequality, which is remarkable enough, but is subject to these caveats. So let me come to some conclusions of these findings. I think the data suggests there really has been recent progress against extreme poverty in the world. There's even been progress against inequality, although it's subject to the caveats that I've highlighted. But they are no excuse for complacency. Poverty at these kinds of extreme levels is, of course, not only morally unacceptable, but it's economically inefficient. It leads to 800 million people, probably more because it doesn't stop at once.
Excuse me, Francisco, your time is running out. Please
okay.
Be short.
Okay, I'll just have 2 more minutes, if I may, to conclude here. So there's been progress against poverty, there's been progress against inequality, but there's no room for complacency, as I say. Both poverty and inequality remain too high. And as I was saying, both ethically, but also economically, people at such levels of poverty don't have the economic opportunities to contribute to the growth in their economies. So the rest of the report, and I won't have time to go into it here, we propose a menu of policies that we've found evidence, credible evidence in the world, that these policies really contribute to growth at the bottom of the distribution in a way that's also efficient. To list a few of them: investment in early childhood and nutrition, better quality education, universal health care, direct cash transfers to the poor, investment in the infrastructure for the people who need it most, poor people in rural areas who have often no access to roads or electrification, so investing in rural roads and electricity. And of course, those things need to be financed, and they should be financed through taxation that's both efficient and progressive. The last 2 slides, which I won't go over because my time is up, have some examples of those policies. One of them here is investment in early childhood development. There's the Jamaican example here on how some intervention with stunted children led 20 years later to people having much higher wages in the treatment group that received the early childhood intervention vis-a-vis the control group that didn't. And then a variety of other examples, as I say, that I won't go over. But the point to make about them is that there is an arsenal of policies that's now been tried in the developing world, which has led has contributed to this decline in poverty and to growing incomes. And the important thing, and I'll end with that, is that we need many more of those policies and much more investment in those policies if we are to meet the Sustainable Development Goal 1.1, because without making growth more inclusive, we will not make it. So we need to attack inequality to get to our poverty goal. Thank you very much.